For those of you who watched the vlog linked above about going legal, as expected, I think it's necessary to do a follow-up. The question was, if someone rips off your IP, should you go legal? And my simple, straight answer was no, but I backed it up with a cautionary tale about a composer called Anne and her husband, Brian, who bankrolled a claim against someone who had stolen some of her IP. They nearly ended up losing everything. But as expected, in the comments beneath this film, that many people have been through similar harrowing experiences. I also want to add here that their actual names aren't Brian and Anne, it's just pseudonyms, just in case anyone thinks I'm speaking about Anne Dudley. It's not. Now, I want to reiterate that I have nothing against lawyers. I have fantastic lawyers who represent me at Spitfire Audio, for example, keep us within the law, protect us against people making claims against us, that kind of thing. I think lawyers are great for drawing up contracts between two parties who have aligned interests. I think the way I always put it is, if you've ever bought a house and have gone through that ordeal, maybe it took you 3 months, maybe it took you 6 months, imagine buying a house off someone who didn't want to sell it to you. So if someone has stolen from you, I can't really help. I would just say, walk away and try and mitigate from that happening in the future. Which brings me back to what I said in the previous video, which is get it right at the beginning, because it's so much more difficult to rectify at the end. And one of you has asked, okay then, how do you go about protecting your IP? So I've organized my thoughts into several short chapters. The general crux of what I want to say is, if you do not value your work, your IP, your time, people aren't going to value it for you. So if you don't want to give away your IP or your time, don't give it away. My first thought is how you go about writing this stuff and who's in the room with you when you're writing it. I think you need to protect that process before you start protecting things a little bit further down the line. I think one of the biggest source of conflicts for bands, other than shagging each other's boyfriends and girlfriends, is the fact that there's a disparity between band members who do write and those who don't. I've certainly been in 3 bands that have split up because the frontman is intent at some point in the band's lifetime generating considerably more money for him or herself than the rest of the band. In my kind of middling years, reflecting on that period, I would have simply said to those front people or those songwriters, well, if you're going to be the sole songwriter of this material, go home and fucking write it then. There are many situations where someone may come in with an idea for something that then becomes something else, that is then abandoned or inspires you, this, that, and the other. You have to ask yourself, would that song exist in the form that it is in had it not been for the contributions of those other players? And that's why I think often with bands that have a huge amount of longevity and success, there tends to be some kind of arrangement. I believe there's an arrangement between the band members of U2 with some kind of appreciation of the fact that Bono writes all of the lyrics. And I think, I may be wrong about this, they involve their manager in that arrangement too. The songs are successful because of this inner team, this inner cause, hard efforts. I think Coldplay may have some kind of arrangement too, and they also have a creative director who doesn't appear on stage with them, even though he's kind of the best looking member of the band. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And then I think if you take examples of Queen, I believe that when they worked up songs together there was an arrangement, but a lot of songs arrived in the studio fully formed. I think Bohemian Rhapsody is an example of that. You know, in the example of maybe bringing an idea that's then abandoned, well, does that not need to be taken into account? Is it all about what appears on the notes of the kind of the leader sheet? And how to define the commitment? Is it the number of words or bars or chords? It's so subjective. I think even Lennon and McCartney had some kind of arrangement where they split the publishing, even on songs that they didn't write. I don't think Lennon ever claimed to have written Hey Jude, even though I believe he may have been credited for it. Who knows? Paul may have come to him with a fully formed song called Hey June, and maybe by suggesting simply changing one letter of that song is the thing that gives it that edge. Colonel Tom Parker, who was Elvis's manager, I think he created the business practice that I think later became known as change a word, take a third, whereby if you wrote anything for Elvis, he would simply take a third because he arguably would be responsible for quite a large proportion of that song's success. Which leads me on to the next point of valuing your IP, valuing the importance of maintaining as much ownership as humanly possible. Dolly Parton was approached by Colonel Tom Parker for Elvis to cover one of her songs, but naturally they wanted to take a third, and she politely declined. She said, no, this song is my kid's future. She understood the value of that song, and that song was I Will Always Love You, which was later covered by Whitney Houston. I see projects or albums or cues or songs, each of those like little kind of entrepreneurial businesses. And what entrepreneurs do with businesses, they kind of develop the idea, they grow the business, and at a point they feel they can most monetize that business, they perform something called an exit or a liquidity event. This is what you're doing every time you give away or sell or license your IP. You're liquidizing or liquidating that potential. You have to ask yourself, is this the right time to sell it, to license it, or to give it away? Because once you give these rights away, the ownership away, it's very difficult to get back. Look at George Michael, look at Prince. Both went through lengthy legal battles to try and retain or regain their rights. Just hang on to your publishing and, where appropriate, your mechanical copyrights, like a Jack Russell with a bone or Oscar with a stick. Keep hold of those rights with all of your will. I gave away 50% of the publishing to a series called 2 Pints of Lager and a Packet of Crisps. Got about $2,000 for it up front, which I really needed at the time. So it was like really kind of, whoa, yeah, and I'm gonna jump on that. Spent it on some equipment probably. I calculate that I lost in the lifetime of that show, which went to nearly 100 episodes, probably over £100,000 by giving up 50% of that publishing. It's quite a bold thing, but I know composers who actually do the opposite of work for hire. What they do is they take no fee, provided they can own both sides of what they've been commissioned for. And what they then do is license it to the client, I guess, with an exclusivity clause. So basically, I license this soundtrack to you to use exclusively on your film and things connected with it for a period of maybe 6 months or 2 years. This can be an excellent way of offering up a counter-offer when faced with coercive composition deals. Yes, I was always going to get there. Coercive deals are when basically they say to you, and they've said this to me so many times, the publishing isn't available on this job. What they mean by that is they will coercively take 50% of the publishing. It'll usually be because they have some kind of exclusivity deal with a major publishing company, and part of that contract will be they have to coerce all composers into signing their publishing across. But listen to how absurd this sounds. So you have arbitrarily, or through greed, or through some deal that you've done 10 years ago, have decided that the rights I am going to assign to you are already not available, even before I've written the stuff that earns the rights that I'm going to give to you. And this leads me on to my next point, and that is worth. You have to look at these deals, you have to look at these projects and think to yourself, well, morally this isn't right to be coerced into a publishing deal. I've given them a counter offer of saying I'll actually work for free because the project's so brilliant and simply license you the material, and they've said no to that. You really have to look at your own worth versus the worth to you of the project, whether that be furthering your career or earning you some cash. And worth, that's where the problem lies for us, because many of us say that, oh, what we do, it's a fucking pile of shit anyway, and I'll just give it to someone else. Do you really think that? I know in my mind of minds what I do is good. I just don't say it is out in the open. And I think I use that as a means of apologising for my terrible business decisions. Another piece of business kind of analysis I've been recently introduced to at Spitfire is looking at the outcome of a project. You work out your kind of P&L, your profit and loss, and then you work out how good it was for the brand, furthering the company on, the association. But you also look at the cost to the company itself from the point of view of what it stopped you doing as an alternative. And this is something I think that we don't do enough as composers, is value our time. I don't know of any composer who goes, well, this is a piece of shit job, they're not paying me much money, so I'm not going to spend very much time on it. I think that we all work to 95%, and if a really amazing director on a really amazing project comes knocking, we push it up that very difficult extra 5%. So you must know in yourself, when someone asks you to do something for free, listen, it'll just take you a couple of hours to do. You know that you will be the arbiter of how long it takes you. But the thing I can guarantee very few composers think about is stewardship. You're not just giving away your intellectual property or sharing ownership of that with some other party. You're not just giving away your time, you're also handing away stewardship to someone else. Okay, definitely the best theme I've ever written was actually something that was sitting on the shelf, and I used that. So I kind of liquidated that asset that I had and put it on the worst film ever made. Okay, it maybe advanced my career because they paid for me to get an orchestra to record it, and it was always the #1 track on my showreel for, I'd say, 15 years. It got me lots of work. So maybe that did play out okay, but still, that IP is sitting on a piece of plop. But the other examples I've been thinking about are maybe 2 scores which I think genuinely I'm really proud of. Not only the scores, but the way the score works with the film and the film itself. Like the composers, the directors too hand stewardship of that production, that IP, over someone who may mismanage that. And both of those films went straight to video on demand. And those were, I think, my greatest opportunities as a composer to earn awards and recognition from other directors, possibly more work. So was the IP squandered? I would say not from a creative point of view, but from a business point of view. The time that I spent, the investment that I made, had a very poor return because it was poorly stewarded. Again, I gave up control of the rights entirely, so I have no power over their secondary exploitation, which is an important thing to consider in this day and age. I mean, look at the theme to American Beauty. How many people on this planet know that tune? How many people have seen American Beauty? It's so difficult to value something that's so abstract, your time and the IP that time is used for to create. I think the dynamic of our working environment lends to us feeling that neither our time nor our IP is truly in our heart that valuable. And I think it's to do with the amount that we procrastinate, the amount of agony that we go over to actually get ourselves to do the work, and then how embarrassing it is when that spark comes, that brilliant moment, because it feels so kind of easy. Well, I can do that once, I can do it again. And then you're being asked to abandon things willy-nilly by egotistical, narcissistic directors, and you have to learn how to not value your work so you don't get upset when it gets chucked in the bin. I think you need to detach your ego from these works, but always value them. And that, I think, is the slightly more difficult, nuanced psychological procedure you have to go through. And when you do inevitably get ripped off, shafted, done up like a kipper, you have to ask yourself, is it worth your time, your effort, your money, and your health, both mental and physical, in fighting it, in getting in a ring with thieves? So to wrap this up, I think it's important to protect the way in which you work. So be careful of who you're writing with, who you're in the same room as when you're composing. I've heard of composers having to give up some of their publishing to directors because the directors gave them instructions whilst they were writing. I think also to avoid spurious claims, I think it's never going to harm you to Dropbox whatever work that you've done that day, so you've got a couple of timestamps to kind of prove that it's you who's been doing this stuff. I know of managers and agents who keep a journal of what they do throughout a day and then just strike a line under it if it's just a continuous notebook, or if they're using a diary, they'll put at what time they ended their day at work, or what they did with the kids after work, or what happened in the news that day. So everything's compressed. You can prove that you haven't added anything to that diary after the time. Just an account of what you've done each day. Quite a nice kind of memorandum. I think the second point is to not liquidate your little businesses, these little projects, these little cues, songs, albums. I think the commonest way of doing this, which I see a lot of people do, is getting fucking publishing deals, which at the beginning of your career is just not a wise move whatsoever. Just get a bank loan if you need 10 grand to spend on kit, which you don't. Next up, try to protect your rights as much as humanly possible. The best way to protect them is to retain them, is to retain control, ownership. Make sure you've investigated every possible avenue on how you can go about maintaining your rights, whether that's you not working for a fee and licensing them, or whether that's them commissioning you as you would expect. Fight for as big a publishing split as humanly possible, and remind them when they're coercing you that they are in fact coercing you. A way I maintain rights is often I will pay for music sessions myself, but I will pay the musicians on a sampling, high-end scale sampling rate, so I can then use some of that material, you know, usually just single notes or staccatos or just kind of cellular phrases. I can use that material elsewhere. And then stewardship. Look at who you are assigning these rights to. It's all, again, about value. The value of your time, your commitment in investment versus the investment they're going to make in return. What is that going to return to you? Is it worth it? And always remember that furthering one's career, growing one's business requires investment as well. So whilst the job may not reward you with a fiscal reward that is commensurate with your commitment, you may find the job furthers your career. And that goes back again to who is stewarding that commitment, that investment. I guess it is possible to go too far the other way, to be too suspicious, or to try and gather your rights and money. You know, we've all worked with slightly grabby people. There's something incredibly unattractive about it. It feels like, hey, we're all on the same team here. So I think be wary of trying to be a legend in your own living room. You do have to take risks in life. I know that PRS is overwhelmed on a daily basis, their switchboards, with people making claims for stuff that simply have no value. I think an example of this is going back to Brian and Anne, and whilst I think they had every right and should have fought for her right to buckle that horrific exploitative craft of not giving female artists their rights that was commonplace in the 1990s. They're absolutely right to do that. I asked Brian how much her PRS distributions have gone up since she gained that small, share of that song, and he said on average about between 50 and 70 quid a distribution. That's $100 every quarter. Was it worth it? Well, from a morality point of view, yes. From a fiscal one, absolutely not. Beware of making spurious claims. I've seen it so often, people mistaking orchestration or arranging for composition. See my video on ghostwriting above. But most important of all, don't steal. We're in this together. We're a sisterhood, a brotherhood. It's not nice to steal from your brothers and your sisters. You can copyright loops, you can copyright samples, and as far as I know, Solaris has been copyrighted. So, making this film, Dan Mace, linked below, has put up a brilliant film about procrastination. I think it's a really important one to watch, to not try and undervalue the process that we engage in order to create our IP. I met a bunch of people who had been ripped off at NAMM, and this seems to be a theme that's building around this vlog, is this sense of being, exploited, being treated badly. I want to say, it's really important to know that you're not alone here. Not only has it happened to a lot of us, it's important to know that there are people that you can turn to, and I would say certainly in the UK, PRS, MCPS and BASCA are brilliant places to go simply for advice. And I think a question to ask these people often is this worth fighting for? And I think that their candid response will help you maybe move on and make the right decisions not only then, but also in the future. Thanks as always for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, plenty more grumpy advice coming. If you want to be notified the next time I put up a video, ding that bell, and one of these always appreciated if you've liked what I've done here. See you next time.